At 7:12 p.m. on October 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentik transmitted 17 seconds of unidentified metallic scraping into his radio, and then vanished from the face of the earth, leaving behind no wreckage, no body, no oil slick, and no explanation that has ever fully satisfied anyone who has looked closely at the evidence. Prologue: A voice in the dark. There is a moment in every great mystery when the ordinary world comes to an abrupt, irreversible end. For the Frederick Valentik case, that moment can be pinpointed with unusual precision. It is not the moment he took off. It is not the moment his engine began to run rough. It is the moment Melbourne's flight service unit recorded that final, strange burst of sound, metallic, industrial, like something being dragged across the hull of a vast steel structure. And then nothing. Silence. Forever. What makes the Valentik disappearance so extraordinary, so stubbornly resistant to explanation, is not merely that a young man and his aircraft vanished without a trace. People disappear in small planes over water with heartbreaking regularity. Aircraft go down, pilots make fatal errors, storms claim lives. These tragedies, though devastating, follow rules. They leave wreckage. They leave oil slicks. They leave, at a minimum, the cold comfort of explanation. Frederick Valentik left none of these things. He left only a transcript. 4 pages of radio exchange so unsettling in its content that Australian aviation authorities, who have reviewed it dozens of times across nearly 5 decades, have never been able to produce a satisfying account of what happened. He left behind a mystery that has resisted every rational framework applied to it, drawn the obsessive interest of researchers on 6 continents, and remained, to this day, officially listed as an incident in which the cause cannot be determined. This is the full story of what happened that night. It is also the story of a young man, who he was, what he believed, what he feared, and what he was trying to prove. And it is ultimately a meditation on the limits of what we know and the vast, disquieting territory that lies beyond. Part 1. The Boy Who Looked Up. Frederick Valentik was born on June 9, 1958, in Werribee, a suburb southwest of Melbourne, Victoria. The son of Guido Valentik, an Italian immigrant who had built a modest but comfortable life in Australia, Frederick grew up in a household that valued hard work and practicality. By all accounts, he was a quiet, earnest, unusually thoughtful child, the kind of boy who spent more time looking at the sky than at anything on the ground. His obsession with aviation began early. By the time he was a teenager, Frederick had decided with a certainty unusual for someone his age that he was going to be a pilot. Not just any pilot, a commercial pilot, flying for a major airline, the kind of job that in the Australia of the 1970s carried genuine prestige and the romantic glamour of the jet age. He enrolled in the Australian Air League, a youth organization modeled on the Royal Australian Air Force, and threw himself into it with a devotion that impressed his instructors and sometimes puzzled his peers. He was, those who knew him recall, an unusual mixture of the dreamy and the determined. He had read widely in UFO literature from his early teens, not with the credulous enthusiasm of someone who simply wanted to believe, but with what seemed like a genuine investigative interest. He kept files. He noted dates and coordinates. He talked about the phenomenon not as fantasy, but as a legitimate, unresolved scientific question, one that deserved the same serious attention as any other unexplained event. His father Guido would later recall that Frederick had once told him, with quiet seriousness, that he expected to see a UFO himself someday. His academic record was less impressive than his passion suggested it should be. He applied twice to join the Royal Australian Air Force as a trainee pilot and was rejected both times. He pivoted to civilian aviation, accumulating flight hours through training programs, eventually earning a Class 4 instrument rating. By the autumn of 1978, He had logged approximately 150 hours of flight time. Capable, but inexperienced. He was working at a Melbourne service station, saving money, biding his time, still believing with undiminished conviction that the commercial license and the career and the life he had mapped out were all still ahead of him. He was 20 years old. He was, by every account from those who loved him, a good person. Earnest, kind, a little intense, possessed of a certainty about his own future that was, in retrospect, both admirable and quietly heartbreaking. The flight on which he would vanish was supposed to be a routine training exercise, a simple trip across the Bay Strait to King Island to pick up some crayfish for family and friends. A night crossing to log hours. An ordinary evening that would inch him a little closer to the career he had worked so hard toward. Part 2. The flight plan. The Bay Strait is a body of water approximately 240 kilometers wide that separates the Australian mainland from the island of Tasmania. It has a reputation among Australian aviators as a demanding crossing. The weather could deteriorate rapidly. The water is cold and inhospitable, and the lack of landmarks makes navigation more demanding than flying overpopulated terrain. For experienced pilots, it is routine. For low-hours pilots, it demands careful planning and respect. On the afternoon of October 21st, 1978, Valentik filed a flight plan for a journey from Moorabbin Airport, a general aviation facility southeast of Melbourne, to King Island, a small island community in the western Bay Strait. Departure was set for approximately 6:19 p.m. The aircraft was a Cessna 182L, registration VHDSJ, a reliable, well-maintained single-engine plane hired from a local flying club. The route was simple: south across the strait, land at King Island, collect his cargo, return. There was nothing irregular about the paperwork. Valentik completed a standard weather briefing and was advised that conditions were, if not perfect, at least acceptable. He fueled the Cessna, conducted his pre-flight inspection, and departed Moorabbin at 6:19 p.m., climbing into the last fading light of a southern spring evening. For the first 47 minutes, everything proceeded normally. Valentik tracked south toward the coast and then out over the water, maintaining routine radio contact with Melbourne's flight service unit. His communications were standard, his navigation appeared accurate, and there was nothing in the early exchanges to suggest this would be anything other than a perfectly ordinary training flight. Then, at 7:06 p.m., everything changed. Part 3. The transcript. Valentik contacted Melbourne FSU with a question that, on the surface, seemed almost casual. Was there any known traffic in his area at approximately 5,000 feet? The duty officer checked and confirmed. No known traffic. Valentik responded that he had a large aircraft below him, passing over him at roughly 1,000 feet, with 4 bright lights that looked like landing lights. The officer confirmed again. Nothing on radar, nothing in any filed flight plan. What followed was a 7-minute radio exchange that aviation authorities, researchers, and ordinary people have been parsing ever since. Reading the full transcript, rather than the fragments most often quoted, is an experience that is difficult to shake. What strikes the reader immediately is not the dramatic content of what is described, but the texture of Valentik's voice as it moves through the exchange. He begins controlled and professional. He becomes, gradually, increasingly bewildered. And then, toward the end, there is something else, a quality that different listeners describe differently, but which nearly all agree is not the tone of a man who is lying. Melbourne, this is Delta Sierra Juliet. Is there any known traffic below 5,000? The duty officer responds in the negative. Valentik describes the large aircraft, 4 bright lights, moving fast, coming from the east. He asks if it could be a military aircraft. Melbourne has nothing. Valentik then reports that the aircraft has passed over him at high speed. Then it returns. Delta Sierra Juliet. It seems like it's playing some sort of game. It's flying over me too, 3 times at a time at speeds I could not identify. The duty officer, Steve Roby, continues to respond calmly and professionally. He has nothing on radar. He takes the reports seriously and asks clarifying questions. Then comes the most frequently cited line in the entire transcript. Delta Sierra Juliet, Melbourne. It's not an aircraft. The exchange continues. Valentik describes the object as long, with a metallic shiny surface and a green light. He says it is hovering above him. His engine begins to run roughly. He reports difficulty with the aircraft and intends to proceed to King Island. The last intelligible transmission before the final burst of metallic sound is, Delta Sierra Juliet, that strange aircraft is hovering on top of me again. It is hovering, and it's not an aircraft. And then the 17 seconds of metallic scraping. And then silence. Roby continued to call Delta Sierra Juliet for several minutes. There was no response. He would describe the experience in subsequent interviews as deeply disturbing, not because of what Valentik had said, but because of the abrupt, total silence that followed. Pilots fly out of range, radios malfunction, transmitters fail. But a disappearance of this kind, mid-transmission, with no distress call, no declared emergency, was deeply unusual. A search and rescue operation was launched. It would continue for days, then weeks, covering thousands of square kilometers of the Bay Strait. It found nothing. Part 4. The Search. Within the hour of Valentik's silence, rescue coordination centers in Melbourne and Canberra were activated. RAF aircraft, civilian search and rescue planes, and marine vessels covered a search area that expanded progressively over the following days as each initial grid returned empty. The weather cooperated. Conditions in the strait were calm and clear, reducing the possibility that wreckage was simply hidden by rough seas. They found nothing. No wreckage. No fuel slick. No floating debris. No personal effects. No body. The Cessna 182L, registration VHDSJ, which weighed roughly 1,300 kilograms and was constructed primarily of aluminium, left absolutely no physical evidence of its fate. This absence is, in itself, one of the most baffling aspects of the case. Aircraft, when they crash into water, do not simply disappear. They leave debris, foam seat cushions designed to float, instrument panel covers, documents sealed in plastic. The Bay Strait is cold, which slows decomposition, but does not prevent it. In the weeks and months following the disappearance, not a single identifiable fragment of the aircraft or its pilot was ever recovered. The official investigation, conducted by the Australian Department of Transport, ran for several months. The investigators confirmed the timeline, validated the transcript, interviewed Roby and other personnel on duty that night, reviewed the meteorological records, and examined the maintenance logs of the Cessna. They found no indication of mechanical failure prior to departure. They found no evidence of disorientation or impairment on Valentik's part. They found no explanation for what he had seen or what had happened to him. The report's conclusion was, and remains, simply this: the reason for the disappearance of the aircraft has not been determined. Part 5. The Theories. In the absence of a definitive explanation, the Valentik case has become a canvas onto which each generation of investigators has projected its preferred framework for understanding the unknown. The theories are numerous, and the most significant among them deserve careful examination. Not because any of them is definitively correct, but because the process of working through them reveals, with unusual clarity, the genuine limits of what can be known. The pilot error and disorientation theory. The most widely accepted explanation among mainstream aviation investigators is that Valentik became spatially disoriented and entered a graveyard spiral, a deadly condition in which a pilot flying at night over featureless water loses the visual reference needed to maintain correct attitude and begins an accelerating spiral descent without realizing it. In a graveyard spiral, the pilot feels no sensation of the turn, attempts to correct by pulling back on the controls, and the result is a high-speed impact with water that leaves very little debris. This theory has real merit. Valentik was a low-hours pilot flying at night over featureless water, exactly the conditions that produce disorientation. The engine roughness he reported could have been a symptom of his own loss of control. The object he described could have been the lights of his own wingtip reflected in the water below, or stars misidentified in confusion, or the planet Venus, which was bright and low on the horizon that evening. The difficulty is the absence of wreckage. A Cessna 182 impacting the Bay Strait at high speed should leave identifiable debris. The strait in that area averages only 50 to 70 meters in depth. A thorough search found nothing. While a clean impact scenario can reduce the debris field significantly, the complete absence of any recoverable material stretches this explanation further than many investigators are comfortable with. The deliberate disappearance theory. A persistent theory in public discussion is that Valentik deliberately staged his own disappearance, that he faked the UFO encounter, flew to a prearranged rendezvous, and began a new life somewhere under a different identity. The theory collapses under scrutiny. To stage a disappearance in the middle of the Bay Strait, Valentik would have needed a second aircraft, a boat, or some other means of extraction, requiring accomplices, pre-planning, and operational complexity that a 20-year-old service station attendant with 150 flight hours is unlikely to have pulled off without a single leak, a single trace phone call, a single financial anomaly. No investigation has ever produced evidence of any such arrangement, and Valentik himself, across 47 years, has never surfaced anywhere. The suicide theory. A variation on the above holds that Valentik deliberately flew his aircraft into the water. The evidence against this is substantial. Those who knew him describe someone optimistic, forward-looking, deeply committed to his plans. He had a girlfriend, a supportive family, genuine enthusiasm for the path ahead. He had booked the flight for a specific practical purpose, collecting crayfish, a convivial errand. The radio exchange, with its bewilderment and its genuine attempts to understand what was happening, does not read as the communication of a person who has decided to die. The UAP theory. The theory that has captured public imagination most completely is the most extraordinary. That Valentik's aircraft encountered a craft of non-human origin, and that the encounter resulted in his disappearance through some mechanism not yet understood. This is the interpretation serious investigators are most reluctant to advance, for obvious reasons. It is unfalsifiable. It requires accepting the existence of phenomena for which there is no conclusive scientific evidence, and it carries the cultural baggage of decades of sensationalized media coverage. But what gives it its persistent grip on the case is the combination of two factors that, taken together, resist conventional explanation. The first is the content of the transcript itself. The descriptions of an object exhibiting flight characteristics inconsistent with known aircraft, the metallic sound, the engine interference. The second is the complete absence of any wreckage whatsoever, which distinguishes this case from ordinary aircraft accidents, even in deep water. None of this constitutes proof. The UAP theory, like all the others, remains a theory. But it is worth stating plainly that among the available explanations, it is no more definitively disproved than any of the others. Part 6. The Witnesses and the Context. One of the most underreported aspects of the Valentik case is that it did not occur in isolation. In the weeks surrounding October 21st, 1978, the Bay Strait region was experiencing an unusual cluster of reported aerial anomalies, events that, taken individually, might be dismissed as misidentifications, but that together form a pattern intriguing enough to have attracted sustained investigative attention. At least 7 separate reports were filed by members of the public in the weeks prior to Valentik's flight, describing unusual lights and objects over the strait and its coastline. These came from a variety of sources: a fishing boat crew near King Island, a farmer in the Western District of Victoria, a commercial airline pilot who reported a bright light pacing his aircraft for several minutes before disappearing. None of these reports was publicized at the time, and none was formally investigated in connection with the Valentik disappearance. More significant is an incident that occurred on the same evening. Multiple witnesses in the area around Cape Otway, the coastal headland marking the northern entrance to the Bay Strait, reported seeing a bright green light moving erratically over the water at approximately the time of Valentik's final transmissions. The witnesses gave consistent accounts of its color, its erratic movement, and its sudden disappearance. Their reports were collected by an independent researcher and submitted to the relevant authorities, but were not incorporated into the official investigation. Steve Roby, the duty officer who took Valentik's final transmissions, gave several interviews in the years that followed. He was, by all accounts, a composed and professional aviation officer, not given to sensationalism. What he consistently emphasized was the tone of Valentik's voice, the way it conveyed genuine, unperformed bewilderment. "I have worked in aviation for many years," he said in one interview. "What I heard in Frederick's voice was not panic. It was confusion. It was the voice of someone who genuinely could not understand what he was seeing." This characterization is significant. Pilots who experience spatial disorientation or mechanical emergency typically sound different. There is urgency, the specific language of declared emergencies, the checklist-driven response drilled into all trained aviators. Valentik's transmissions have none of this quality. He sounds, instead, like a man looking at something he cannot explain, attempting to describe it as accurately as possible, and genuinely puzzled by its existence. Part 7. The investigation continues. The official Australian investigation closed without a finding in 1983, 5 years after the disappearance. The case was not solved. It was simply archived. But the unofficial investigation has never stopped. Over the following decades, the Valentik case attracted the sustained attention of a small but dedicated community of researchers, some working within the framework of aviation accident investigation, others approaching it from the direction of UAP research, and still others simply drawn to it as one of the great unsolved puzzles of the modern era. Their collective efforts produced reanalyses of the transcript, meteorological studies of conditions over the strait that night, interviews with witnesses, freedom of information requests for classified aviation records, and careful mapping of the cluster of sightings in the weeks surrounding the event. In 1983, a sandstone anchor of the type carried on small aircraft was reportedly recovered near Flinders Island, not far from the area of the Bay Strait where Valentik was last in contact. The anchor was consistent with the type used on Cessna 182 aircraft. The Australian Department of Transport investigated, but could not confirm it came from VHDSJ. The discovery generated brief headlines, and then subsided into the general archive of ambiguous evidence that surrounds the case. The father of Frederick Valentik, Guido, spent years pursuing the case with a devotion that is both admirable and heartbreaking. He corresponded with researchers, attended conferences, filed FOI requests, and never stopped publicly arguing that his son had encountered something real and inexplicable. He died in 2002 without an answer. In 2012, an Australian documentary revisited the case in detail, interviewing surviving witnesses and aviation experts. It produced no new conclusions but introduced the story to a generation that had not been alive in 1978, and renewed public interest in a case that refuses, decades on, to deliver the closure that our narrative instincts demand. Part 8. The silences between the words. There is a particular kind of evidence that is difficult to weigh in a formal investigation, but that carries, for many people, a visceral persuasive force: the evidence of what is absent. In the Valentik case, the absences are extraordinary. There is no wreckage. There is no body. There is no oil slick. There is no explanation for the object Valentik described. There is no account of what produced the metallic sound in the final 17 seconds of transmission. There is no record of any other aircraft in the area. There is no explanation for the engine roughness. There is no explanation for why a 20-year-old pilot with 150 hours of experience, flying a reliable aircraft in acceptable conditions, simply ceased to exist. Each of these absences can, individually, be explained away. Aircraft have sunk in the Bay Strait and left minimal debris. Pilots have become confused and described ordinary phenomena in frightened, dramatic terms. Engines do run rough, but the cumulative weight of all these absences together, pointing in the same direction at the same moment in the same location, produces a profile that is genuinely difficult to account for without recourse to something extraordinary. The philosopher of science Karl Popper argued that the mark of a scientific theory is not that it explains everything, but that it specifies in advance what evidence would falsify it. Applied here, the graveyard spiral theory would be falsified by the discovery of wreckage inconsistent with a high-speed water impact. The deliberate disappearance theory is already falsified by the absence of any financial or logistical trace of an escape plan. The UAP theory, being unfalsifiable, is beyond the reach of this framework entirely, which is precisely why it cannot be accepted as a scientific explanation, but also precisely why it cannot be definitively ruled out. What we are left with is a story that has no ending. A young man flew south into the evening sky and did not come back. He left behind a voice on a tape, describing something he could not understand. The voice was calm, and then bewildered, and then, perhaps, frightened. And then there was the sound of metal against metal, and then the silence. Part 9. What Frederick believed. To understand what happened to Frederick Valentik, or more precisely, to understand why the question refuses to go away, it helps to understand what he believed before he took off from Moorabbin Airport on the evening of October 21st, 1978. Valentik believed in UFOs, not in the vague, pop-cultural sense of believing that there might be something out there, but in the specific, evidential sense of a person who had read the literature, tracked the reports, and reached a considered conclusion that the phenomenon was real, unexplained, and worthy of serious attention. Those who discussed the subject with him described someone who was careful, who distinguished between reliable and unreliable accounts, who was frustrated by the scientific establishment's dismissal of evidence he found compelling. He had, more than once, expressed the belief that he would personally encounter a UFO. This has been used by some investigators to argue that what he reported that night was a misidentification driven by expectation, that he saw a conventional aircraft or an atmospheric phenomenon and interpreted it through the lens of his prior beliefs. This is a legitimate hypothesis. Expectation shapes perception. This is one of the most reliably demonstrated findings in psychology. But the hypothesis cuts both ways. If Valentik was predisposed to see UFOs, he was also a trained pilot predisposed to recognize aircraft. He had filed a detailed flight plan, completed a weather brief, and was 3/4 through a solo night crossing of a major body of water, not the mental state of a person prone to dreamy misidentification. His descriptions were specific, consistent, and technically articulate. He used the language of aviation. He talked about flight characteristics, speeds, lights, and positioning, not the language of someone spinning a fantasy. And there is the matter of the engine roughness. Engines do not run rough because a pilot misidentifies a star as a UFO. If Valentik was experiencing genuine mechanical difficulties at the same moment he was describing the object, then whatever he was seeing was either causing those difficulties or coinciding with them in a way that demands explanation. Part 10. The Legacy. The Valentik disappearance occupies a unique position in the cultural geography of the unexplained. It is not the most dramatic UAP case on record, nor the case with the most witnesses or the most comprehensive investigation. What it has instead is something rarer and more powerful: the voice. The recording of Valentik's final transmissions has been broadcast, reproduced, and listened to millions of times. It has been analyzed by linguists, voice stress analysts, aviation psychologists, and ordinary people across 6 decades. And across all of this attention, the same quality persists. The voice sounds real. It sounds like a person encountering something genuinely unexpected, genuinely frightening, and genuinely inexplicable. This is not proof of anything. People can perform confusion and bewilderment, but the Valentik transmission is not a performance. It is a radio exchange with a government air traffic control facility, recorded in real time, by a person who had no foreknowledge that it would become a historical document. Its texture is the texture of the unrehearsed, and that texture, once noticed, is difficult to dismiss. In the years since the American government's formal acknowledgement that UAP are a genuine national security concern, a process that accelerated dramatically with the release of authenticated naval footage and subsequent congressional hearings beginning in 2017. The Valentik case has been revisited with new eyes. It is now one of a body of pilot-reported incidents that serious, credentialed investigators discuss without embarrassment. The cultural landscape has shifted. The question, what did Frederick Valentik see, is no longer a fringe question. It is, for an increasing number of serious people, simply an open one. Epilogue: the open file. The file on the disappearance of Frederick Valentik remains open. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau, successor to the body that conducted the original investigation, has confirmed that the case has never been formally closed, not because there is any expectation of new evidence, but because no satisfactory explanation has ever been produced that would justify formal closure. That is, in its quiet way, a remarkable fact. Aviation authorities are not in the habit of leaving cases open indefinitely. The system is designed to find answers, to attribute cause, assign responsibility, and use the findings to improve safety. The Valentik case has defied this system for nearly half a century, and that resistance is, in itself, a kind of evidence. What happened to Frederick Valentik on the evening of October 21st, 1978, over the cold waters of the Bay Strait? The honest answer, the only answer that does not require us to pretend to a certainty we do not have, is we do not know. We know what he said. We know that he disappeared. We know that no wreckage was ever found. We know that no conventional explanation has adequately accounted for all the known facts simultaneously. Beyond that, we have theories, hypotheses, speculations, and the sound of his voice on a recording made in the last minutes of his life. Frederick Valentik was declared legally dead by the Australian government in 1983, 5 years after his disappearance. He had been planning, according to his father, to celebrate his 21st birthday in November of that year. He never made it. The sky kept him, or something in the sky kept him, or we simply do not yet understand the mechanism by which a person and an aircraft can vanish so completely from a world that has so many tools for finding things. The Bay Strait is wide and cold and deep in places. On clear nights, when the stars are reflected in the water, it is very beautiful. Fishermen work it. Ferries cross it. Aircraft fly over it every day and every night, and nothing unusual happens. The world turns. The strait moves. And somewhere in the file of unsolved things, somewhere in that vast archive of questions without answers, the case of Delta Sierra Juliet sits open, waiting. It will wait a long time yet. Frederick Valentik, 1958 to 1978, declared. VHDSJ Cessna 182L, missing, Bay Strait, Victoria, Australia. Cause of disappearance, undetermined.